So good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this winter webinar. It's really lovely to see so many of our members joining us on this, what is a very wet and windy evening. And I would just like to say a huge thank you on behalf of the Trust for all the support that you have given us over the past year. My name is Jane Wigan. I'm Events and Courses Officer at the Trust, and today I'm mainly going to be behind the scenes, just helping this webinar run smoothly. And in a moment, I'm going to be handing you over to Tony Whitbread. But before I do, I just thought I'd take you through a few housekeeping points, just so that the webinar can run smoothly. So we're planning for this talk to run for about an hour this evening, and we plan to finish at 7 p.m. promptly. Tony's talk should be about 40 minutes long, and then we will be taking questions towards the end of the session. You'll see that your camera and microphones are turned off, and they'll stay turned off for the whole of this session. So you can see us and hear us, but we have the very strange situation where Tony and I can't see any of you. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen that there is a Q&A button. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Tony, you just need to click on the button at the bottom of the screen, type in your question, and then I will field these to Tony at the end of the webinar. In the same way, if you've got any issues or you need to contact me because you're having trouble accessing the webinar, you can type something into the Q&A box and I will respond to you as best I can. If you're still having trouble with the tech and you can't access the webinar at all, not to worry, we're recording this session and you should all get an email automatically about 4 or 5 days' time, and that will have the link to the recording and you can enjoy that at your leisure. You'll also see a little hand at the bottom of the page, and we just ask that you don't use that this evening. If you have any queries, if they can just go through the Q&A box, that would be fantastic. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Tony Whitbread, President of Sussex Wildlife Trust, for his talk on Global to Local. Thank you very much, Tony.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to join you this evening via webinar, if not in person. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to share my screen if that button works. It started at the wrong place, hasn't it? Obviously. There we go. Great. Yes. Well, thanks very much. I've called this this talk from global to local, and what I'm going to be doing is just talking through this subject, a few of my own thoughts. And I think some of us probably remember the old phrase, you know, thinking global, acting local. So I thought I'd kind of play around with that sort of idea, and you know, think about the global situation and the local activity. I suppose this should come with a health warning, because actually I think, as they say in football, this is going to be a game of two halves. And the first half is going to be actually very depressing, because I'm going to be looking at the global situation, the global statistics, where we actually stand when it comes to our situation in relation to nature, biodiversity, wildlife, and so on. But do stay to later on, because actually it's not all going to be depressing. But I think even though this is the season where we're looking forward to Christmas and everything's supposed to be nice, I don't think we should sugarcoat where we are when it comes to wildlife and the environment. And also 2024 has been quite an interesting year. Maybe they all are, I don't know. But in 2024, there have been various reports coming out and various conferences. And you've probably heard about the COPs. There's been COP 16 and there's been COP 29. There always seems to be a COP, good COP, bad COP, I don't know. And what are they? I mean, a lot of people on this call are probably very familiar with the COPs that have been sitting this year. COP stands for Conference of Parties. COP 16 was the biodiversity COP, and COP 29, Conference of Parties 29. That was for the about climate change. But I thought it would be quite helpful to go back to where this kind of started. Where did these Conference of Parties actually come from? And if we go right back, these originated from the 1992 Earth Summit. Now, I can certainly remember that. I guess a lot of us can. We can remember back to 1992 and what was actually agreed then. That was a key point in our history, really, because that was the time when we were committed to doing things. About 190 countries around the world, they signed two key, well, more than two, but two key conventions. One of them was the Climate Change Convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was signed in 1992. That was when we decided, yes, the science is clear. Yes, climate change is happening. We need to do something about it. That's when the Climate Change Convention was signed. The same with the Convention on Biological Diversity or Biodiversity, the Biodiversity Convention. That was also signed in 1992, again by about 190 countries. Yes, we see the situation. Wildlife is in peril. Things are bad. We need to do something about it. Great. So that was 1992. Everything was solved, wasn't it? Well, was it? Let's go back. What actually was the situation like in 1992? Back then, world population about 5.4 billion. Quite a lot, 5.4 billion. Carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was 350 parts per million. That's actually quite critical because these days we see that as the safe level for carbon dioxide. We should not be going over 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. I think most of humankind has been, the concentration has been below 300. So maybe 350, our climate might have been safe if we'd have stayed below that. Remaining wilderness back in 1992, of course, it depends how you measure it. Depends what you actually count as wilderness. But I got this figure from David Attenborough. He's generally fairly reliable. So about 50%, half for nature. That's a reasonable sort of starting point. So 1992, actually, I think that was a key time when we saw that something needed to be done because all of these points were actually at a critical stage. Where are we today? Well, these are the figures for today. Population 8 billion, so it's gone up quite a bit. Carbon dioxide concentration 420 parts per million and rising. This has not been experienced by humans before, and actually I don't think it's been experienced by any ape in our family before. So actually, the high concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is without precedent in our history. Remaining wilderness, again, it depends how you measure it, but I took it from David Attenborough, so at least it should be comparable. Less than a third left. So that's actually, there's been quite a lot of change since 1992. Since 1992, when we said we were going to deal with these problems, well, it's not looking good. We haven't really dealt with them, have we? And what's the driver behind this? The other figure I found was actually about world economic activity. That's the world GDP. Gross domestic product. If you count up the gross domestic product for all the countries in the world, in 1992, it was $25 trillion, US dollars. Today, it's about 110 trillion. Now, if we look at these figures, sometimes we think, well, it's all down to population. We really need to control our population. Well, I'm sure population is a problem, but if you look at the figures for that, population has increased by 30%, world economic activity has increased by 400%. And actually, most of that increase has come from countries where the population is not really growing very much. So yes, population, there probably are too many of us. We shouldn't shrink from that. But it's our economic activity which is driving all these changes. Maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe everything's fine. And maybe in spite of all this activity, maybe the world is okay. So let's have a look at some figures. The other thing that came out in 2024 was the Worldwide Fund for Nature's Living Planet report. They do this every 2 or 3 years. So this is figures for up to 2023. So the Living Planet report came out, and again, it was quite a shocker when you looked at some of those figures. If you look at extinction rates of species around the world, quite shocking. You see the extinction rates are going up and increasing. I've seen somewhere that extinction rates, species go extinct all the time, but there's a background level. And the extinction rates we have today are at least tens of times, perhaps hundreds of times more than the background level. Some scientists say we're in the middle of the world's 6th mass extinction, which is sobering, isn't it? We're losing species as fast as when that asteroid hit the Earth 66 million years ago and did for the dinosaurs. So this is a little bit worrying. We are in the 6th mass extinction. Perhaps even more worrying is this figure here, which the Worldwide Fund for Nature does every couple of years. This is a plot of the reduction in populations of animal species around the world. They've looked at, I think, 30,000 populations of animal species around the world and worked out how they've declined since the 1970s. In 2019, populations had declined by 68%. In 2021, they declined by 69%. By 2023, they declined by 73%. So things are getting bad, and they're getting bad faster. It's incredible to me that actually, nearly 3/4 of the animal populations that were around in 1970 are not there anymore. And that's in spite of all these worthy conferences and targets that we've signed up to along the way. I can remember back in 1972, there was an Earth Summit then in Stockholm. And that kind of neatly lines up with where some of these figures started. There's the Biodiversity Convention signed in 1992, when we said we're really taking this seriously, we're really going to do something. Can't really see much progress there. CBD, Convention on Biodiversity Plan. Yes, we'll have a plan. Let's do that. Then we have some targets signed in Aichi in Japan. There've been biodiversity targets. There've been targets that all countries have done, and still no great improvement. 2 years ago in COP15, the biodiversity COP15, that's when the United Nations said, okay, we've got to do something about this. You've really got to, the countries have got to go away, come up with plans for how by COP16, how the countries are going to stop the reduction in biodiversity by 2030. That doesn't sound to me like a very ambitious target. Just to try and have a plan for stopping it get worse by 2030. I look at this graph and I think, well, what would happen if this was an economic graph? What would happen? What would people say if the world economy has declined by 73%, and hopefully we're going to have a plan for stopping it decline further by 2030? I don't think they'd be terribly pleased, but we're kind of accepting of that when it comes to the natural world. And by the way, since COP15 and by COP16 this year, hardly any countries had delivered a plan, and none of them had implemented one. So it's not looking very good. And that's these sorts of species, fairly familiar things around the world where we're losing, on average, populations are declining by 73%. And it's not just these species a long way away. We bring this right back to home, the turtle dove. Now, I'm sure a lot of people looking in today will know about the turtle dove. 98% reduction roughly since the 1970s. Used to be a very familiar sound in the English landscape, something that people have described as the sound of a contented cat purring. It used to be normal. Used to be able to go out there and just hear these birds all over the place in the lowlands of Britain. Declined massively. They're thought to be the next bird that's likely to go extinct locally in this country. And how long will it be before it's just a kind of shadow that our grandparents used to tell us about? And one day there used to be this bird that sounded so fantastic, nobody's heard it for years. How long will that be? This is really kind of depressing. And here, just while we're on the depressing note, here's something to consider. This is mammals, the weight or the biomass of mammals around the world. If you weigh all the mammals around the world, 96% of that weight will either be humans or our livestock, plus a couple of cats and dogs, that sort of thing. 96% of the weight of mammals around the world is us or our livestock. Only 4% is everything else. Only 4%. Lions, tigers, antelopes, badgers, whales, all of that, just 4%. And think back to what I was saying earlier about economic activity. We seem to be planning to expand continually into the natural world. But if that's a measure of how far we've got left to go, there's not much left to go. The other thing I'd like to just raise here is that 2024, the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research and the Stockholm Resilience Centre together, two very high up global research centres, have published the Planetary Health Check. They do this every few years, and it's getting more and more accurate with time. This is Johan Rockstrom. If you want to Google him, he's a fantastic scientist, proper peer-reviewed science about planetary health, the health of the planetary system. And what they've done is identify 9 planetary boundaries that we should not go over. Okay, so 9 planetary boundaries. If you want to find out more about this, then there's one of the best films that David Attenborough has ever done is called Breaking Boundaries. I think you can get it on Netflix. That's well worth watching. How are we doing when it comes to the 9 planetary boundaries? Well, here we are. We need to be well within the green space. And look at that. For 6 of the 9, we're way into the orange and up into the red. Because of the subject of today is more about nature and biodiversity, these are the biological systems. How are we doing when it comes to biological systems? Biosphere integrity, that's nature. Biodiversity, biosphere integrity, way into the red. Land use, fresh water, how that works, again, way into the amber, coming into the red. Biogeochemical flows, yeah, big words, but basically how's nature functioning when it comes to all the great systems that keep us all going? Again, way into the red. This is really, really worrying. Of the nine planetary boundaries, 6 of them we've broken very badly. We need to get back into that safe operating space. And I think the thing to stress here is the vital role of intact nature. This is something that people are stressing much more these days when it comes to the activity, the operation of our global system. We need to have intact nature for those planetary boundaries to be maintained. So there's a vital role of intact nature. Oh my God, it's the end of the world. Isn't this depressing? Why am I going on like this? Here we are, and it's coming up to Christmas, and I'm telling you how bad the situation is. The world is ending. We're all going to go to pot. There's another way of looking at this. Yes, the figures are bad. Eco-anxiety is probably the appropriate response. We should not be sugarcoating this stuff. We should know about how bad our global situation is. However, there's another way of looking at it, and that is these sorts of figures don't go on forever. The scene is set for disruptive change, the whole system being disrupted and going to a different state, which could be very positive. Now, what do I mean by disruptive change? And I want to spend a little bit of time just thinking about this idea of change that happens on a quickly and on a large scale. What does that actually mean? And there are many really good examples of how this works. And one I want to show you is actually perhaps in some ways not a very good example, but it's about horses in this street in New York in 1900. So a street completely dominated by horses. The question then, where's the car? There's one little car in there that somebody circled, a kind of chitty chitty bang bang type thing. That'll never catch on. Smoky, horrible thing, slower than horses. So yeah, that change can't possibly happen. 13 years later, same street, where's the horse? And the answer is, well, you can just about see one, but it's a situation completely dominated by cars in just 13 years. Bearing in mind the hundreds, perhaps thousands of years where the horse had been the major method of transport, and actually all our settlement patterns, all our transport, everything that we relied on was built on the idea of, well, you get about by horse. But within 13 years, completely transformed, completely disrupted by this new technology, which was the car. And it's not just new transport, everything around transport changed as well. And I think there's a couple of things to think about with this example, is that with disruption, it changes very quickly. We tend to think as humans about slow change, and we have to move things on very slowly and in a kind of transformational way. That's the case sometimes, but very often the big changes happen quickly. They start very, very slowly, and people think nothing's going to happen, and then it goes sigmoidal, a kind of S shape. It goes up very, very quickly and levels off again. So this kind of accelerated change is a characteristic of disruption. The other thing that's a characteristic of this, in my opinion anyway, you might disagree, is that actually most people fight the disruption. They hold back and they want to go back to the past. And there's often strong arguments about how we mustn't change, how it would be immoral to change, how it would be wrong, how we rely on this past technology. There are people relying on it, so we shouldn't change. So this is very much a characteristic. I should imagine in 1900 onward, there are a lot of people really worried about this change and how their businesses were going to be themselves disrupted. And yet the change happened. The people who were going with the disruption were the ones that did best. Henry Ford, in that sort of situation with the Ford Motor Company, he said at one time, if I would listen to people, then I'd have developed a faster horse. Instead, he went with the disruption, and we know what happened. So this is a key point about disruption. And I just want to label up a company here or a think tank called Rethink X. I'm not going to say very much about this, but if you're interested in what this might mean, then I'll just suggest you Google this and have a look at Rethink X. They think we're at the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of human civilization in history. Because it's not just one or two things that are going to be disrupted, it's whole areas of our civilization. They point to energy is going to be disrupted by what we call renewable energy. That's going to change things. Transport is going to be disrupted because of electrification and the way we're changing our whole attitude to transport, getting hold of things without the need to travel. Food is going to be disrupted because of modern technology there. All of this can be questioned, and I sometimes think they're a little bit rosy about it, but all of these things can be questioned. All of these things are likely to be disrupted. And I was looking at energy there, and I was thinking, well, we're going in the direction of renewable energy, and yet we're still holding on to fossil fuels. And this could be an example of where the disruption is fought against by certain sectors of society which actually rely on the past rather than the future. So is this why we're subsidizing fossil fuels to an enormous extent? And that seems to be getting more so, not less so. So are we holding on to a past technology, fighting against the disruption, when it'd be far more logical to go with the disruption and look to the future rather than to the past? I was thinking, okay, so the idea of fast change, big charge change, something that happens quickly, does that have relevance to the natural world? What sort of things have happened in the past? I mean, you've seen changes in the past. Maybe that is in the natural world, maybe not. I sometimes think about the Renaissance. That was supposed to be a time when there was a big disruptive change, where whole paradigms in the way we thought changed. I don't think anybody then was thinking, oh, isn't it good to be halfway through the Renaissance? Some of these changes, some of these big changes, you can only see in retrospect. And it may be that already we are going through a major paradigm shift, a major disruptive change. And maybe some of that has relevance in the natural world. Maybe that some of that has relevance locally. So I was starting to think these are only my thoughts, but what is a kind of indicator of big change in the natural world? Well, going back to the United Nations, the way that the United Nations declared the 2020s as the decade on ecosystem restoration. Yes, I've heard that sort of thing before, and most of those graphs earlier that I was showing you, they were saying similar things. But maybe it is different this time. This is from the Director General downwards. This is not just one department. This is the whole emphasis behind the United Nations. And it's not just looking after what we've got. It challenges everyone to massively upscale restoration efforts, breathe new life into our degraded ecosystems. So it's not quite the same language as try to stop it getting worse by 2030. In my mind, this is a sign of actually, no, we need to turn a corner here. So that was one thing. Another kind of thought I had was our attitude to species. Now, in the 1970s, there was a very successful campaign, completely correctly, about it's wrong to hunt these big animals, big sentient beings that have been around for a long time. It's just wrong to hunt them, so we shouldn't do that. Yeah, fairly successful. But we look at these animals now, and we can see, yes, of course, they're huge sentient beings, and it would be wrong to hunt them. But they're actually, as well as that, they're drivers of ecosystem processes. And I think the great whales are a fantastic example of how we can look at that. The great whales, there used to be a lot of them. They're rather large, as you know, whales come in large. They're rather large, and they have a very big appetite. Now, how that works is the whales swim down quite deep into the ocean, and they hoover up vast amounts of prey, mostly krill, that sort of thing. Trillions of krill in the Antarctic area get hoovered up by these whales. The whales then swim up to the surface into an area where there isn't any krill, and that's where they defecate. That's where they poo. That's where they excrete. What that does is that supercharges the ecosystem in an area which is low in nutrients. But those nutrients then go into the ecosystem and supercharge the growth of algae, which then feeds right into the ecosystem, firing up the whole ecosystem. When I was at college in the 1970s, it was thought that the reduction in whales would mean that there would be a lot more krill. That hasn't happened. What's actually happened is that as we've reduced whales through hunting, the krill has gone down as well, because we've actually damaged that cycling system that whales were driving. So this is a nice example of how our attitude towards these sorts of things can change. Yes, you know, it's wrong to do the wrong thing by them, and we shouldn't lose that. But actually, it's not just a nice to have either. These things are actually driving ecosystem processes that are absolutely vital to our existence. By the way, by charging up the ecosystem like that, whales cause that ecosystem to increase in size, more algae, which actually then floats down, sinks down to the bottom of the ocean when they die, and that's a carbon sequestration. Restoration of the great whales could be a way of actually combating climate change. So it's a way of thinking more deeply about the role of animals in as ecosystem processes. And I think that marks a change. The other change we've seen is, yes, there have been protests before. A small girl with pigtails sitting outside a Swedish embassy for some time, nobody paid any attention to that. Well, they did start paying attention. And pretty soon there was a huge movement behind Greta Thunberg. And not long later, she was actually addressing the United Nations, the world's great and the good. Yes, this is a picture of Greta Thunberg. We've also got Bella Lack in this country and Vanessa Natake in Uganda. So all around the world, there are people making an impact, and it's being taken more seriously than in the past. There's a much bigger movement. People say that there was a big movement in the 1970s as well, so we don't want to see it die this time. And that goes more widely as well. Was it last year, year before? There was this Restore Nature Now. No, I think it was earlier this year, wasn't it? The Restore Nature Now protest in London, which I went along to as well. A huge protest. It was actually nearly 10 times bigger than the farmer protest that was the other day. You could easily have missed it because it didn't really get the press that other protests have got. There was no violence. Nobody was arrested. Nobody glued themselves to anything. So it didn't get noticed. It's a shame you have to do that to get noticed. But this is, again, a sign of a big change of people aligning behind a common cause. About 25 years ago, I think I went on a so-called protest or some sort of demo in London, and there were a couple of dozen of us. It was a bit pathetic. Things have changed. The other thing I'd like to mention is rewilding. Now, I'm not going to talk about rewilding in terms of its ecology or anything. I'm not going to talk about it in terms of farming, but just thinking about it in terms of the way it's actually interrupted our thoughts on nature conservation. I think we were doing this anyway, but I think the NEP Wildland project has moved thinking along a lot more than in the past. It's not just about looking after the best areas. Vital though that is the first priority, but we can't achieve nature conservation. We can't achieve environmental resilience by just looking after the best bits. We need to restore and rebuild and recreate. And one way of doing that is with rewilding. And that really seems to have grabbed the imagination of a lot of people. 25, 30 years ago, when we did maps of good places to do nature conservation, NEP wasn't on there. This is an ordinary farm, which was just left is the wrong word, but it was rewilded. And actually the ordinary farm that was doing badly in terms of agriculture, a new opportunity came up, rewilding was tried, and you could see how this area greened over once the whole attitude was changed towards rebuilding nature. What did the United Nations say? Breathing new life into our battered ecosystems. That's what it was doing. And good things happen. So we're watching NEP, and there were many of our records are actually massively improving. So huge numbers of species, often species that are quite rare, and NEP has become a hotspot for all sorts of declining species. You go there now, and it's one of the best places in Britain for purple emperor butterflies. Cuckoos are doing well. Turtle doves are doing well. Nightingales are doing well. Many species that are doing badly elsewhere are doing pretty well here. And it's not just NEP. Obviously, it's not just NEP. You go onto Rewilding Britain, this was a while ago. I think you'll find even more dots on this map now. So rewilding is challenging the way we think about conservation and moving us on, has really pushed us more towards the whole restoration, rebuilding, new life sort of agenda. It's one way, it's not the only way of doing nature conservation. And it's not just on land either. 30 years ago, it would have been very difficult to do anything in the marine environment. But as you probably all know, we've been very successful in getting a kelp restoration project going over 300 square kilometres off the southern Sussex coast. Get the kelp regenerating again, and actually all the other things that follow come along as well. We lost about 96% of our kelp since the 1980s. Now it's being restored, and hopefully there are signs of it coming back again after just 2 or 3 years of this restoration project. So the marine environment as well. Then we get to our nature reserves. Well, you could look at these fairly small dots and realise if you add up all our nature reserves, and I think everybody else's nature reserves as well, it comes to less than half of 1%. That's not to degrade the idea of nature reserves. They're some of our best habitats around Sussex. They punch well above their weight. They have a very important reason for existing. And this is the critical point. You know, nature reserves are small in the fullness of Sussex, but they have a very important role. They are themselves, they're refuges for huge numbers of species. All our nature reserves hold something like 10,000 species. So our nature reserves are vitally important. But we're getting down to the local now and how small areas, small things can actually make a big difference. And I'd like to show you this example. This was Amberley Wildbrooks in the 60s. That sort of time. It was our first nature reserve. In case you can't see it, there it is. I'll put a circle around it. Just a few fields in the middle of the Amberley Wildbrooks in an area that was pretty soon to be severely threatened. So it was the first nature reserve, a few fields in 1967. 1978, there was a plan to drain the brooks in order to improve it for agriculture. 1978. That was when sites of special scientific interest were essentially voluntary concerns. You could get grants to destroy them. It's incredible now, but the Ministry of Agriculture would provide you with money to destroy sites of special scientific interest for agriculture. And that's what was happening in Amberley Wildbrooks in 1978. So with our very small nature reserve, and aligning with people like the Amberley Society, we were able to fight to try and stop that draining from taking place. And it was successful. You know, tiny organisation, very tiny field, fighting against something which was the main emphasis at the time was drainage restoration for agriculture, and the case was won. I think that date is quite interesting because in 1981, not long after that, that's when the legislation came in to protect sites of special scientific interest. And I wonder if this was one of the stimuli to actually change national legislation to more effectively protect sites of special scientific interest. So it's really a cause célèbre, but it actually makes this point about how doing something against apparently insurmountable odds locally can actually achieve things. And today, this is what it looks like. It's not all nature reserve, obviously, but the area within the red boundary, that's the area that's protected by the highest level of protection in Europe. And the whole area is now a refuge for wildlife. Much of it is being managed very sympathetically, partly by the Wildlife Trust and RSPB, but also by surrounding landowners. So yeah, things could be better, but actually that's quite a change from being given grants to destroy it. Now I'd like to actually look at the example of Pevensey Levels. Now, some of you may have been at the annual general meeting a while ago because I used this example then as well. Pevensey Levels, a fantastic area between Eastbourne and Hastings. In fact, our nature reserve is a kind of wide triangle along the A259 between Eastbourne and Hastings. Fantastic work being done there. Some huge amounts of investment being put in to massively improve the area. But there's an interesting irony. When I started with the Wildlife Trust in the 1990s, one of the earliest things I was doing was trying to fight against a huge dual carriageway that was going to go the length of our nature reserve. It was going to go completely across Pevensey Levels. Then it would have gone further east through Wallershaven, across Coombe, then the length of the Breed Valley and across Rye Harbour. It was part of a huge, almost motorway that was planned across the whole of the southeast of the whole of the south of the country. Areas like this are still threatened sometimes, you know, going west past Binstead Woods in West Sussex, were under the threat of having a huge motorway put through them. I put this example in because actually that was an insurmountable odd. The entirety of the economic community was saying this road is absolutely vital. Otherwise, the economy will collapse. It'll be absolutely terrible. We need better communications. We must deliver this. They were saying the same thing about airports. And in early 1990s, we were told that we need a new runway in the southeast every 5 years, otherwise the economy would collapse. None of that happened. One or two short stretches of road were built, but that motorway didn't happen. Those runways were never built. And actually, the economy didn't collapse. There was no sign of it actually doing any worse than it was doing beforehand. In fact, it seems to have done better. So things can seem like insurmountable odds, but actually things change. And there's an irony here because Pevensey Levels, that vast amount of investment being put into that area in order to enhance it still further. It is a site of special scientific interest, and that money is being provided by the Highways Agency. So that's fantastic. As part of their plan to, contribute to restoration of nature, they're actually paying for major enhancement of an area they were planning on destroying 30 years ago. And I want to move on a little bit and talk about how nature reserves or good areas fit within the wider landscape. Here we are, Ebano Common. A lot of you, I'm sure, know Ebano Common. That's it down in the bottom right-hand corner, and that's the Barbastell bat on the top left-hand corner. The Barbastell bat lives in Ebano Common. Look after Ebano Common, the Barbastell bat will be fine, won't it? Well, actually, no. The Barbastell bat simply roosts in Ebano Common. It actually makes use of the whole landscape. This is the wider landscape. Ebano Common is roughly in the middle there where all the dots collect. Every colour is a different bat. What they actually do is, yes, they roost in Ebano Common. Ebano Common has to be in very good condition as a good roost, but actually they fly off into the surrounding landscape in order to forage. They need to get out. They need a very high quality landscape. They need to get out along these flight lines in order to forage, in order to hunt for prey. These bats can travel 30 kilometres each way a night in order to forage. And what they need is a very high quality landscape with interconnected belts of woodland and trees, well-wooded little valleys and so on. Some of these go as far as Pulborough Brooks, which is, as I say, 30 kilometres away. So they need an interconnected landscape. What the Trust did here, as well as look after Ebano Common, we liaised with the surrounding landowners who are very sympathetic to see, well, what can we do to enhance these flight lines just by beefing up some of the hedgerows? Very effective. And we also expanded Ebano Common into an area next door to it. Again, very effective. That bat population has probably increased it's almost doubled as a result of some of this work. And it shows what you can do with relatively small activities in a local area. And that opens up the whole idea of ecological networks or nature recovery networks. And sometimes I think we can be downhearted if we see our little nature reserve or our garden or a small patch as just an isolated blob in a sea where nothing much is happening. You can look at that in a different way. It's actually one node within a much bigger network. And this is very much something that's happening these days. And we're learning that things do make use of those nodes. You do get animals and colonizing along these kind of stepping stones of apparently isolated habitat. Here's an example. I live in Horsham District, and this is a map of Horsham District. It's a nice area. These are some of the best bits, sites of special scientific interest. That's Knepp in the middle, the big green blob in the middle, and some other sites all around it. So that's not bad, but that's much better. And this is the plan within Horsham District Council, how you can actually work with people, organisations, landowners, to see how you can connect up these areas, build buffer zones around good areas, make linkages, make stepping stones. When you have a conversation like that, sometimes these linkages and stepping stones, it's more flexible about where you put them, so you can have a more general conversation. It can be presented as an option rather than something which is a harsh, you must do this here. So the idea of nature recovery networks, which is now part of our planning legislation. And it's not just local authorities or local conservation bodies that are doing this. You've probably heard of this. This is the Wheel to Waves. It's a project which was originally stimulated by two landowners, Knepp Wildland in the middle there, but also an intensive arable farmer at Climping Gap. They got in touch with each other and said, well, why don't we go down the valleys? Surely we can do something to link up the valleys through Sussex, starting at Ashdown Forest, running down some of the major rivers to the sea. Loads of people came on board. Loads of people started to see this as a very exciting idea. Here's a picture of some of the originators. Large landowners to start with, but now spreading much more into smaller landowners. Loads of community groups as well, individuals, people with gardens, And it's interesting how, given the opportunity to just think of doing something, it's not solid, it's not saying you must, it's here's an option, what can we do something? And quite interestingly, here's a picture of a cuckoo roughly in the middle. One of these was tagged in NEP, and completely by chance, it was plotted flying south, and it actually followed the green line that's drawn on this map, actually made use of the network before it was even there. So it kind of shows how interconnectivity can work. And drawing to a little bit of a close now, what I want to do is bring it right down to a local level. Here's a picture of Woods Mill. I think a lot of you will be familiar with Woods Mill. And I want to actually say a little bit about our local Sussex Wildlife Trust group, the Storrington and Arun Valley group. And it's just one example of a local group, in this case, a local wildlife trust group, doing things locally and actually having an impact locally. All sorts of projects were picked up, either have been or are being done locally by this one group. And again, it's, as I say, it's just one example. There are these sorts of things all over the place. The project on pollinators, wildflower meadows. People are actually starting to build their own wildflower meadows. They're sharing seed in their own gardens or even in larger plots of land. Buildings and wildlife, putting in nesting boxes for various birds, swift boxes, house martin boxes. What can we do in churchyards to get that balance between keeping it neat enough to be respectful, but actually messy enough to be rewilded, so that wildlife can actually thrive in this area? Hedgehogs, linking up gardens, trees, mapping veteran trees, finding out where they are, how they can be protected. Roadside verges, managing roadside verges. Invasive species is a big thing in our sort of area. Himalayan balsam there, very satisfying thing to do is to go along and pull up large amounts of Himalayan balsam. It is an invasive species you can get on top of. So these are examples of things that can be done locally in order to actually have an impact locally, which adds up. One phrase I think is worth remembering is everywhere is local to someone. So if people take up their actions locally, then it adds up to something. I think one of the environmental activists said once, nobody's coming to save us. We can't rely on global leaders. We can't rely on national leaders. We have to do it for ourselves. So it's about local action. I want to finish now. I want to finish now with one example, which is about swifts. This again is one of the key projects that was done in our local wildlife trust group. I know there are projects all over the county looking at what you can do for swifts. Swifts need a few things. They need nest sites, so encouraging them with nest boxes and swift bricks, that sort of thing, very valuable. They also need food, so it keys in very well with the idea of how we look after our gardens, our meadows, our countryside, and so on, reducing pesticides, increasing nectar sources, so we have more pollinators, increasing fuzzy edges, so there are more living space for insects. So it keys in with that. They need insects as well. But one problem that swifts have is, like many species, the biggest mortality is generally in migration. So swifts migrate south, going south to Africa. And I think one of the biggest hurdles they have to overcome is the Sahara and the surrounding dry areas. Now, the Sahara and the surrounding dry areas are getting bigger and drier, presenting more of a barrier to migrating birds like swifts. So why is that? Well, we know why that is, don't we? It's climate change. Things we are doing here in order through our economic activity, emitting carbon dioxide, is driving climate change, and that climate change is actually driving the expansion of the Sahara and the Sahel region, even getting up into dry areas in Spain these days. So that area is expanding, making it harder and harder for swifts to migrate and other birds. So in my mind, that's quite a nice example of how global things affect us locally, and local things affect a global situation. So everything's connected. The swifts are connected to us because they're showing how the north is connected to the south. They're also connected to our activity, so we can actually make things better for them here, or worse for them here if we get it wrong. But also it's connected to the way we live our lives, because actually what we're doing locally to drive climate change is affecting something globally, which is actually impacting on the swift population. So that's it really, everybody. It's just, thinking global and actually the activities locally, but also how working locally can affect things globally as well. So just a few thoughts on a rainy day outside, and thank you very much for listening. I'll now hand back to Jane. Thank you. There you are, Jane, back
I'm
again.
here. I've returned, and thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I've written. I'm looking forward to the idea of disruptive change. It makes me feel very excited.
I'm just
Um,
sharing my screen now. Yeah, there
okay,
we go.
lovely, fantastic. So we've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions, which I can put your way, and I'd like to start with. We've got, how do we stop the takeover of so much countryside in order to build the houses that the government tell local councils we have to build?
Oh,
The big
wonderful. Yeah,
question.
yeah, we've been here before, haven't we? This is such a thing, and I'd spend hours talking about this. So how do I be quick? On one end of the spectrum, actually, loss of countryside to development is not one of our biggest problems, which is surprising. In some ways, it's not big because actually it's a fairly small area relatively. In other ways, it's very big because it drives other things like the problems we have with sewage pollution and so on. But it is very critical because actually we're losing so many important places in a local sense with this housing development. All we can do is carry. We've been fighting planning inquiries for decades when it comes to this sort of thing. Um, in my mind, some of the basic premises behind the need for house building are false. But you can't really argue against it on that. You can locally, you can only argue against what's in front of you, um, and that can be fairly effective when you're stuck at that sort of level. Often you can change the way things are developed. You don't necessarily have the ability to stop it entirely. I spent a lot of my career actually trying to stop it entirely because I think that battle has to be fought. But actually, there are some good developers out there. There are different approaches. There's now biodiversity net gain. I know there are problems there, but it means that biodiversity should be enhanced as a result of any development, but it's a problem. So I can't really answer that in any way that's very helpful because it's something that we've been fighting with for donkey's years. House building is going up. House building wants to go up according to the government, and it's on a false premise. It's not down to population increase. It's down to the fact that there are fewer people per house, and that continues. Very thin answer to a very important question.
It's a very big question, isn't it? Thank you, Tony. So the next one. This is referring back to you talking about Ebano Common. Says this year was good for toads at Ebano Common because the ditches did not dry out, so the tadpoles survived to develop. Almost, alas, most years in dry conditions, the tadpoles die out in June. Is there any solution to this?
Wow, interesting. Yeah, there's so many things in that. It's particularly a case with toads because they like deep ponds that they don't want to dry out. But there's a whole host of organisms which actually rely on temporary ponds. So a temporary pond is not a bad thing. If it's too temporary and it dries out before, particularly frog tadpoles have had a chance to develop, then that's a bad thing. But actually, having a pond that dries out can be very good for a kind of suite of species. But you're right, there is an issue and things are changing. Of course, it's climate change, things becoming more irregular. So some years are very dry, some years are very wet, some years are wet or dry at the wrong time. So things are changing. Like so many of these things, I think the answer is by driving more complexity in our landscape, making our habitats more complex, more diversity, less simple habitats, more interfaces between habitats. It's the sort of thing that's driven by rewilding, but actually that has to work at a large scale, whereas actually what we need to do has to be done at a small scale. So when we look at our habitats, when we look at our areas, I think lots of complexity, lots of layers of vegetation, lots of different habitats in close proximity, different topography in close proximity. That's probably the best way to build a landscape which is resilient to these changes.
Great, and I presume this will apply slightly to the next question as well. What do you consider to be the contribution of domestic gardens to the preservation of nature?
Oh, fantastic question. It's interesting. I kind of hinted at it because we can get depressed by seeing our little gardens as one little space and there's nothing and nothing else there. But I think thinking of them in terms of being part of a wider network, and I think we've found that this is more effective than we realised years ago. I'll give an example. There's a school in Brighton, the Dorothy Stringer School, which developed a butterfly bank, a fantastic thing, within an apparent green desert. It was a school field which had like 2 species of grass in it, so not much. But they turned it over, they made these banks, and they introduced some wildflower seed mixtures with the idea of attracting butterflies. Okay, well, that wouldn't work very well, would it? It's in the middle of the town. Within a year, there were 12 species of butterfly there. I understand now, several years later, there are about 30, which is an incredible rate of colonisation. And these are species that we often thought wouldn't come into new habitat. So these things are there. These things are around looking for somewhere to survive. So actually, I think that really builds up the idea that stepping stones or little refuges, even in an apparently hostile area, are really very valuable. So I think it can be more of a, our gardens can be more of a benefit than we think. Think about the coast of Sussex. It's a belt of developed land. Very difficult for nature to get through that. So anything we can do in our gardens to actually green up that area, make it more permeable, more attractive to wildlife, the better.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to take you from a local question to a global question. It says this is also hopeful, but the impact is so awful. Is there proof that what is happening here is affecting those terrible numbers?
Is there proof that what's happening here is affecting those terrible numbers? I don't. I'll say it the other way around. Our local figures reflect that general decline. It also depends where you measure from. If you look at the recent statistics, Europe and Britain don't look that bad. And the reason is because we've already lost most of our wildlife before the 1970s. So actually, if you look at the WWF report, places like Southern America and Latin America and Africa look worse, because actually they've lost more wildlife since 1970, whereas we lost all ours hundreds of years ago. So actually, yeah, I think our losses reflect the global situation, but that actually we are starting from a lower base. It's the idea of shifting baselines. We think things were nice when we were young, and that's what we measure against. Whereas our parents think things were nice when they were young, and that's what they measure against. In fact, we should be thinking back about 1,000 years. What was it like then? How do things compare then? And that could be quite depressing.
Okay, thank you. This is a practical question. Is there a Wilder Horsham district map available online?
Oh, I don't know.
And yes, I'm not sure if there's
There
one
might
available
be. I'm
online
not
either.
sure. That's worth a question going to the Conservation Department. It may be online, the Wildlife Trust, or it might be online with the District Council. I think actually it's part of the local plan, so it may be published in the local plan.
Okay, we'll have to go and look that one up. Thank you. Just having a look down.
I see the numbers have gone up for questions.
Yes, got time for a couple more. So how can we achieve our overarching nature recovery goal with so much of the UK countryside in private ownership?
Working in partnership with private owners. Yeah, that's one thing we do a lot. So the nature reserves, say we doubled our area of nature reserves with massive effort, it would still be nothing. So nature reserve have a special role, which has to be recognised, but we can't turn the whole of Sussex into a nature reserve. Meanwhile, there's a lot going on with sympathetic people with their own objectives. And I think nature within reason is actually quite robust. There's plenty of ways you can work with all sorts of different landowners to get benefit. And I think that's one thing that I find very encouraging, especially in the last few years, is that I suppose people have always been sympathetic, but it feels like there's actually almost been a turnaround, and there's more and more landowners are really keen to get on to how they can improve their area. That's the strength of the Will to Waves project. I raised that one, but it's probably only one example of many ecological networks or many partnerships that are being formed, within within landowners networks. And in partnership with conservation bodies. So I don't see it as a problem or something to worry about, the fact that most of the land is in private ownership. I think it's just a way that we choose to work, work in partnership with whoever. And there are plenty of very good examples. At opposite ends of the spectrum. Knepp is one end of the spectrum with its rewilding. The Norfolk estate is at the other end of the spectrum, highly intensively managed agricultural land, but because of the way they do things, they've actually managed to massively enhance biodiversity.
Just having a look down the list.
Or even just comments, you don't have to.
Yeah, no, we've got lots coming in. It says, might there be a role for beavers in the levels?
Oh, might there be a role for beavers? Wonderful question. Actually, probably I wouldn't go so much for Pevensey levels for beavers. I think it's the upper catchments. It's very interesting. I was in a meeting just yesterday where they were talking about beavers and how valuable they are in ecosystems. We should know this by now. They are ecosystem engineers. They do all sorts of benefits. They create massive complexity in wetland environments, which itself holds back water, reduces flood risk, creates complexity for different species and habitats. So all of this goes on, and it has all sorts of pollution ameliorating effects as well. So beavers deliver massive amounts of gain. Yet there are issues with beavers, and they have to be managed well. But all those questions have been answered in countries around the world. So yeah, I think beavers have a massive role to play. They're probably the animal that we most need back in order to restore our habitats. I wonder if I'll get any reaction to that.
Well, I'm going to take you to a comment because we're just running out of time. But you may want to respond to it. It says, not a question, more of a statement. Donald Trump has appointed someone who is a committed fracker and very big in the fossil fuel industry to be the person in charge of America's energy policies. To quote DT, we're going to drill, baby, drill. I wonder what another 4 years of that policy will do for the climate.
I almost feel like just leaving that there because I think that's so relevant. I mean,
it's
a worry, isn't it? It's a worry.
About.
Yeah.
It's an important one to think about.
Again, it's people fighting the disruption rather than looking to the future. Yeah.
Lovely. And I think on that note, it's 7 o'clock. Lots of other questions pouring in, and I shall have a look at those after the webinar is over. Tony, thank you so much for the talk. It was absolutely fantastic. As I say, I've sort of written down that I'm feeling very excited about disruptive change. And thank you also for making the insurmountable feel surmountable. And I hope people are going to look more into the projects that you've talked about this evening. I would also like to say a massive thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. When this webinar closes, you're going to be automatically redirected to our species recovery appeal page, and any donations towards that cause would be greatly appreciated. If you would be interested in knowing more about the work that Tony has mentioned tonight that the Trust are doing to restore nature, we're going to have a series of webinars happening in the new year that will give more detail on specific projects. So if you keep an eye out on your e-newsletters, we'll be sending out further details over the next couple of months. So thank you, Tony, once again for a fantastic talk. To everyone, I hope you have a very restful December, and hopefully we will see you all again online soon. Thank you very much.